I think that Gitcoin itself is a pretty protopian project in that we have these quarterly grants rounds, and the grants rounds are like a metronome. Every quarter we have one, and we design them in concert with the community, and we execute them. And the goal is not to be perfect. It's just Protopia. It's to be better than it was before.
Welcome to The Regeneration Will Be Funded. This is a show exploring regenerative finance and pathways to a life-affirming economy. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and today I'm joined by Kevin Owocki, founder of Gitcoin. Folks may remember we had Kevin on in season 1 when we were at the ReFi Summit in Seattle, and we just completed the Ma-Earth grants round, which is hosted on Gitcoin, and Gitcoin was actually also a matching pool funder in the round. So many thanks and gratitude to you, Kevin, for helping us incubate a lot of the projects here at Ma-Earth. And welcome back to the show.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Awesome. And today you just spoke at DevCon and you're announcing your new book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually just gave my talk at DevCon about an hour ago, and at DevCon this year, I'm releasing a new book called the Onchain Capital Allocation Handbook. That sounds like a mouthful, but capital allocation is just when you spend money in order to achieve an outcome, whether that's profit or impact. And on-chain just means that you're doing it on a blockchain. So we're starting to explore the design space of how we could do a better job of funding impact and funding what matters using blockchains. And boy, the design space is so cool.
Gitcoin has really started to popularize quadratic funding as a capital allocation mechanism on chain. But I guess the book starts to point to all of these worlds of other possibilities. Can you share more, and what are some of the other examples?
Yeah. So Gitcoin started with quadratic funding, and as of Q4 2024, we've delivered $65 million worth of impact to the Ethereum ecosystem and people building in Ethereum like Ma-Earth. And quadratic funding was invented by Vitalik Buterin and Glenn Weil and Zoe Hitzig. It's not something we invented, but it's something we discovered, and it's sort of supercharged Gitcoin's growth. And we really love quadratic funding. We've done 22 rounds of quadratic funding once per quarter for the last 6 years or so, and learned a lot about it. But as the ecosystem progresses, there's been a lot of other mechanisms that people are excited about. And so by venturing from quadratic funding to other mechanisms like retro funding and conviction voting and guilds and Lotto PGF, and there's a bunch of stuff out there, we're kind of, we're exploring different parts of the design space. And one of the things I really like about doing that is that we're going to have a plurality of different funding apps where we can fund the causes that we care about. And quadratic funding doesn't have to do everything. It can just do one thing and do it well. And so I envision a future where we have a plurality of different capital allocation mechanisms funding all the different plurality of public goods and causes out there. And so we're in the very early stages of exploring that design space. And maybe some of those will be brought into Gitcoin grants rounds into the future. So if Gitcoin 1.0 was a screwdriver, it was just quadratic funding. Gitcoin 2.0 is kind of like a multi-tool. It's going to have multiple different tools, and the job of the round operator will just be to choose which tool is right for the job that they want to do.
And you've kind of created this experience for round operators like Ma-Earth to come in and run a quadratic round on Gitcoin. But then you've also abstracted the tooling to API layer with Allo. Can you share more about what is Allo and what's the vision?
Yeah. So, I mean, Gitcoin's mission is to help people fund what matters to them. And I think there's something beautiful in helping people fund what matters relative to their own value sets. And Ma-Earth, as a round operator in GG22, had its own round that was focused on what matters to your constituents. And, so that's our reason for existing. That's our why. That's our North Star, fund what matters. And one of the things that we're realizing is that the optimal experience is to build Gitcoin Grant Stack, which is basically a tool for someone like you who understands basic things about blockchains, to deploy a quadratic funding round or a direct grants round or a retro funding round on chain. But there's actually an experience that we can offer to developers to build their own custom mechanisms. And that's what we call Allo protocol. Allo protocol is short for Allocation protocol. And it's a protocol that helps you build more secure, better funding tools faster than ever before. So you can kind of look at our offering as hitting people who can just use Web3 apps at one level, and then also one for software developers that want to build the next power tool for doing funding infrastructure. So different audiences, different constraints, but there's a lot of power at both levels.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I really appreciate about the approach is this iterative cycle. And I feel like it's like so much of the future is path dependent, and like there's just something so magical about having this quarterly or semi-annual approach of something that starts and finishes. Like it's like a season, it's like a heartbeat, it's a rhythm that then we can iterate all these different aspects. And like we even saw that from grants round 1 to 2 with our community rounds on Ma Earth. Like there were just a lot of things that we brought on new team members. We did our storytelling differently and better. We knew how to finalize the round differently. Like we were better prepared. And then we identify new gaps and new things to go deeper in. And how do you think about all of that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot about the philosophy of Protopia when I hear you talk about that. Have you heard of this word Protopia?
Yeah, but maybe share more.
Yeah, so basically utopia is a far off distant future that we might achieve that's better than the one that we have today. And Protopia is this idea that instead of investing in a far off future that we may not ever reach, Protopia is just about getting better every week, every quarter, every month. And so Protopia is about pulling ourselves towards a future sort of inch by inch, week by week, month by month. And the definition of Protopia is just that each time period is better than the time period before it. And I think that, when people see my work, they think of me as a utopian. And there's, that I think that progress is possible, and that utopia in some ways is sort of like a flawed philosophy, because you're dreaming about some far off future that may not ever come. But with Protopia, you can demonstrate momentum and actually build your movement, build credibility. And the epistemology of why people believe in you is because they see you making progress, and so they join your cause. And so, I think that Gitcoin itself is a pretty Protopian project in that, like you said, we have these quarterly grants rounds, and the grants rounds are like a metronome. Every quarter we have one, and we design them in concert with the community, and we execute them. And the goal is not to be perfect. It's just Protopia. It's to be better than it was before. And so there's this thing called the OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, act, repeat loop that we go through every quarter, where we basically observe what the community wants and what happened last quarter, what's now happening in the blockchain space. We orient in that space, we decide what's on our roadmap, and we act in that we execute, adding new features and making the user experience better. And then the cycle starts all over again. For GG23 will be our next one. And what I think is really cool about that is that it allows us to demonstrate progress. And sometimes we screw it up, and that's just, the nature of being an agentic person, is that you're not perfect, and you do mess things up, and we just try to learn from those mistakes every round. And sometimes there's even rounds where it's one step forward and 3 steps back, because you want to go from climbing one local maxima into climbing a new global maxima. And I think that when Gitcoin, when we sort of like imploded the company and became a DAO, that was an example of 1 step forward and 3 steps back. But we're slowly reclimbing the maxima of being a DAO and figuring out how to operate in that way together. But iterative, evolutionary, Protopian ecosystems are, I think, a great way of demonstrating progress. And a lot of the crypto space is all about immutability and hardness and never changing. And I think that we're sort of pioneering a new philosophy that's about evolution and agility within certain bounds. And it's a great way to build momentum.
Yeah. I was just listening to John Fullerton, who coined the term regenerative economics. And he was talking about how one of the key paradigm shifts is seeing the economy as a living being. and really taking this like kind of livingness approach to how we build these systems. And it reminds me of that, in that contrast of immutability and like, this smart contract has to live forever versus something that's dynamic and evolving and living and like receives community feedback and iterates. And yeah, I don't know if that provokes anything, but it strikes me as an important part of how we need to be designing these systems in the future.
Yeah. I actually wrote a post about this on the Gitcoin Gov forums about ephemeral DAOs. So basically, if you try to design a DAO to live forever, DAOs are just digital organizations for the people who aren't Web3 native that are listening. But basically, if you're trying to build a DAO that lives forever, then it has to be sort of like really perfect in how you set its initial conditions and how those evolve over time. But one of the really cool things about a quadratic funding round or a retro funding round, and by the way, I do think of quadratic funding rounds and retro rounds as just ephemeral DAOs. They last for 2 weeks, they spin up, they do their job, and then they spin down. And one of the cool things about that is that there's just way less pressure to get it perfect when you're only going to do it for 2 weeks. And I think there's a lot of value in experimenting in a way that is Pareto optimal and creates action and isn't expected to be perfect from its onset. And so that's kind of the philosophy that we've tried to bring to designing these things. And I hope to see more ephemeral DAOs and ephemeral experiments that iterate towards better designs every time they run.
Another post you recently wrote was around donor fatigue or grants round fatigue, and then guilds. Can you share more? What was the message there, and how you're thinking about it?
Yeah, we're getting so plural. We're getting into many mechanisms. So basically, guilds are a mechanism that's been pioneered by this project called Protocol Guild. They're basically a smart, they're at their base layer, they're a smart contract, which is a list of addresses, 200 addresses of people that maintain the Ethereum execution and consensus layer clients. The non-technical people in the audience, just Ethereum infrastructure. And the Protocol Guild has been really great in making it easy to let projects give back to the infrastructure upon which they depend. So before, if you were going to fund Ethereum core protocol development, you would have to go find everyone and gather their addresses and distribute to it. But now you just fund the Protocol Guild, and it has a vesting contract, and it distributes to all the people on that list. So the guild you can kind of think of as like an aggregation of labor. And, we're kind of playing in the same territory that unions did in collective bargaining agreements, but in the 21st century in an on-chain way. And I think there's really something profound there in doing this in a 21st century native way. And the Protocol Guild has sort of demonstrated that you can aggregate the supply of labor, and you can also aggregate the demand of the people who are going in to fund these things. And so that's the Protocol Guild and the mechanism that they've developed, and it's basically just an aggregation of labor. And the other thing that's sort of been happening is that in Gitcoin's wake, there are now tens, maybe hundreds of public goods funding experiments across the ecosystem in dozens or hundreds of different DAOs. And if you're a grantee, if you're someone who's trying to do good work in all of these ecosystems, it can be really fatiguing to try to keep up with what's going on in all of these different ecosystems. And don't get me wrong, I think people are thankful that we have this philosophy of funding what matters to us, but it's just really hard when it's happening in a bunch of different places. And so the idea here is, what if we took the guild mechanism and we sort of like aggregated the funding and sales and those types of functions, and created these sort of funding routers that went out to all the different rounds and then pulled in the money and then distributed it for you automatically. And so we're going from I almost think of it as like a single player use case or like a single ecosystem use case where there's like one Gitcoin round, which is what it was in 2020, to now a multiplayer, multi-ecosystem use case. And there's an opportunity to aggregate supply and demand, to batch process these things and create a better user experience from there. So Protocol Guild really pioneered the guild mechanism. And now there's people who are looking at, instead of having a Protocol Guild, having a dev tooling guild or a climate guild or all different types of guilds. And so it's just one of the mechanisms that we cover in the Onchain capital allocation book. Guilds are really powerful.
Yeah. I already see so many resonant themes happening with our grants rounds friends and partners. We had both Samantha Power and John Ruth advising us on this round. John has been one of the coordinators of the Climate Coordination Network, CCN, which was really, I think, the first community round focused on climate-related themes that's been running on Gitcoin several times now, distributed a lot of capital to really great work. And then, Samantha doing the bioregionalism with Benjamin Life and Monty at ReFi DAO. And so we're already like kind of in Telegram groups trying to understand, like, well, how do we think about projects that are applying for multiple rounds at the same time? In some ways that's a benefit. In other ways, you want to give space to other people. We had nested layers of projects, like a project applies for Ma Earth as a land project. It's also part of a bioregional, aggregation in the BioFi round, and they're using a tool that's, been funded by CCN. And then they have an open source software piece that's over here with the Web3 tools. And yeah, so there's certainly a lot of surface area that will probably continue to cohere at different nested layers.
Yeah. This gets back to my sort of point about plurality, in that there's a lot of different tools that do one thing and do them well, and they can be combined into these like super organisms that are an aggregation of each of them. And one of the things that I really think about plurality is like, it's beautiful to see this diversity of tools and people who are working on shared causes together. And I think of plurality as sort of a meta-primitive, a primitive for resilience. So basically, like if one of these tools gets taken out, then you're not taking out the entire supply chain. There's diversity there. But one of the trade-offs between diversity, plurality, is efficiency. And because you have to learn about all these other things, and you have to figure out which one you're going to use. And so, I think that we should aim for a system that's resilient on some level and also efficient on another level. And the cool thing about these little tools being everywhere and being modular is that we can sort of build bridges between them and build bridges between that in that trade-off space. And so it's the very early days of this design space. I mean, blockchains have only been around for 10 years, and Gitcoin-like structures have only been around for 4 or 5. And I think it'll continue to evolve, sort of taking it back to the iterative evolutionary nature of what we talked about before. We've already got the evolutionary algorithm of trying to get a better UX every quarter, and now we're just pointing that evolutionary algorithm at these types of problems instead of the problems that we had 3 years ago, which were more around like, how do I fund this grant without paying $7 in gas? Like, so the evolutionary nature of this has stayed, but just the problems that we pointed at are different now.
Yeah, I still remember making a donation in, maybe it was like GG16 or something, where it was like my gas fees were higher than my donation amount. It was like $50, $100 in gas fees on Ethereum. And, now we're down to pennies, and, it's been good progress.
We were one of the first apps to deploy a layer 2. Layer 2s are Ethereum scaling technology. And in 2020, we were one of the first apps to deploy a layer 2. And I was always really proud that we were pushing the frontier of what's possible there.
Well, speaking of that, and I mentioned the BioFi round. I mean, I know that the BioFi round was actually inspired by a tweet that you had, and that our mutual friend Benjamin Life was one of the round operators. But it gets at another theme I wanted to ask you about, because the BioFi round, for those who aren't familiar, it's like these bioregional financing facilities, these activations at bioregional levels, and kind of also rhymes with some of the themes you were speaking to with guilds, where you have huge amounts of capital that are coming from potentially like nation states in terms of climate funding, but who tends to get that capital might just be big monolithic corporates or huge top-down heavy programs that aren't connected on the ground. But you can't ask the average like regenerative farm to go out and know how to apply to all of these different types of funding mechanisms. And so thinking bioregionally is quite interesting, because it allows, from a funding perspective, some intermediating function, people who might be closer to those communities, but who can also abstract out some of the capital allocation or acquisition rather. So yeah, that BioFi round happened, but I know you're also kind of thinking about this in terms of how Ethereum's tools can be used and this kind of cosmolocal and localism movement within the Ethereum space. And I've heard you kind of, make gestures towards this in a variety of contexts. So I was wondering if you could share more about all that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I will do it, and I'll also try to explain what I'm talking about along the way. So I'm going to call with my mom like 2 weeks ago, and she's like, "You're using a lot of words that I don't know." So, okay, so bioregionalism. Let's just start there. As I understand it, this is an idea that watersheds are a natural delineation in nature, where basically, if two organisms are in the same watershed, then they're coupled in some way because they share resources, water and air and all those things. And so you start to get these sort of natural boundaries in nature around the watershed. And one of the things that I think is an opportunity there is that we could build infrastructure that helps people in a bioregion support other projects in a bioregion because they are mutually interdependent on each other. Now, of course, we're all interdependent on some level globally and locally and all up and down the stack, but we're more dependent within a bioregion on each other than we are with people across the world. Like bioregions feel like nature's sort of like dividing lines. And so that's like point one. That's what a bioregion is. And point two is that I happen to be of the belief that we're in a world in which the geopolitics are changing, and it's possible that we'll be in certain parts of the world. This is already true, but it's possible it could increase over the next 10 or 20 years. But that international and national level agreements, the social safety nets and the sort of like coordination that we've developed in the industrial age will start to break down. And then that will leave us being more dependent on our families, communities, local cities, and states, more so than before. So like the sort of collapse or the evolution of the international system and us moving to a more multipolar world is like the second thing that I see. And so, the question is, how do we organize locally? And I think that, if we were to rebuild from scratch all of our funding infrastructure, I think a really interesting idea would be, instead of having states, which is, in the United States, we literally have these like boxes that were just drawn by a bureaucrat 300 years ago. I think we would organize around bioregions. And so if we're going to be building this structure to fund earth, materials, and biodiversity, we should build funding infrastructure that contains bioregions within themselves, and then encourage people to fund within their bioregion the work of regenerative farmers and biodiversity and climate and all those things. And that might be a really important thing. And then I think crypto infrastructure can be pointed at those bioregions in order to help people coordinate within them. And of course, we should be funding things up and down the stack, from like units as small as like families and communities all the way up to the world. But like an interesting convergence between the global and the local is the bioregional. And I just think there's a lot of opportunity to fund bioregions. And maybe I'll stop there, and then we can talk more abstractly about cosmolocalism from there.
Yeah. Well, I just add one funny anecdote. We had a conversation with Carl Burkhart, who is the co-founder of One Earth, and they actually created kind of bioregional maps many years ago that have been often cited and used in terms of thinking about, well, where are those natural bioregional boundaries? And he recently released a post and was sharing in our episode that the earliest use of the word bioregion that they could find was actually in the academic literature, and it was scientists, I think I got this right, describing the behavior of a blue crab. And it was essentially the bioregion of the blue crab was like everywhere that it would go to get its resources to basically live and survive. And so like that was its bioregion. And then that was like a word that started to get adapted and used in all these other different contexts to kind of, often now mean, like you said, the ecological boundaries or kind of the natural contours of what makes sense rather than just random lines on a map.
Yeah. That actually begs me the question of what a bioregion would be under the sea, because you don't have like watersheds in the same way. But Maybe I'll
But
have to look
yeah,
that up later.
I don't think it's really often used exclusively in the context of watersheds, because it could be a mountain range, it could be, other forms of geological contours.
Yeah.
But we did actually talk to Carl about that too, and that the ocean does have very different types of ecosystems that have essentially their own bioregions as well.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think of it like how clustered are the organisms in an ecology with each other is maybe like one measure of a bioregion, and maybe there's not like clear delineating lines. There's overlapping concentric circles or something like that. But
and then for those who want to go down the permaculture rabbit hole, there's like edge effect or ecotones, and it's like often the most interesting things that are happening ecologically are at those edges where like maybe bioregions meet. And so you see like a lot of evolution in the edges, which also kind of, starts to trigger thoughts about how we do governance and funding, and trade and these types of things. But anyway, you were going to talk about cosmolocalism.
Yeah, so cosmolocalism, as I understand it, is about the relationship between the local and the global. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about where we are in this point of time right now is that I'm almost 40 years old, and I grew up in the 90s when during the Clinton era in the United States, we had this sort of era of globalization and a new era of international trade. And in the United States, that meant that a lot of our manufacturing was hollowed out and sent to other countries. And globalism of the 90s, I think, was sort of one interconnected coupling of the international system. And I think our politics are much different now, and the world has evolved a lot over the last couple decades with the internet. And I think that we're trying to navigate and create a new relationship between the local and the global. And I think of the sort of opportunity that we could have to really make the global commons, things like open source software and the internet, in service of the local. And so, like the example that I use of a broken relationship between the global and the local is I think Facebook, where they gave people the infrastructure to set up community groups in all these different areas, and then you build your community on Facebook, and then they sell advertising against it. They spy on you, and they sell it to advertising, and then they upregulate the most divisive information, because that's what allows them to sell more advertising. And so I mean, I think that we're in a place right now with Ethereum and with open source software where I think it's like it's possible to deploy open source into your community and to organize in that way. And one of the eventualities that I think would be really cool in the next couple decades would be for people to take these on-chain capital allocation mechanisms and to deploy them in their local community. And I think that there's an inversion of the power relationship here that can happen because this is open source and they're modular tools. It's not some company in Silicon Valley that has a fiduciary duty to maximize profit in my community, extracting from my community. It's open source software, which I have sovereignty to adjust and to use, that I can deploy in my community, and I can organize locally using coordination software that's world class. And I think there's an opportunity to sort of build a campaign where what works in Portland, we can because it's open source, we can fork it and pull it to Boulder, and then we can pull it to Washington, D.C., and we can sort of refine the software and coordinate with all the best parts of globalism and world-class software development, but then really leverage local trust networks and local legitimacy in order to fund what matters in these local communities. So I'm talking very concretely about how we could use like quadratic funding and retro funding locally, but there's a more abstract sort of movement in cosmolocalism about renegotiating the relationship between the global and the local that promotes more sovereignty and human freedom and interconnectedness than maybe arguably the globalism that we naively deployed in the 90s and 2000s did. So these are some ideas that are floating around the Ethereum community right now. And I just went to, a couple months ago, this conference called the General Forum for Ethereum Localism, which, that's a mouthful, but just Ethereum localism is, I think, a group of people who care about the cosmolocal and using Ethereum to fund artists and agricultural campaigns in these local communities. and I think it's a vibe.
That was in Portland, right?
It was in Portland,
Yeah.
and in February, I'm planning on bringing it to Boulder before East Denver.
Cool.
So franchising it from one locality to another.
Nice. What's happening in Portland in the Ethereum community keeps catching my attention, and I haven't had a chance to visit and dive in, but it reminds me, I live in a rural community in New Zealand, and a lot of what we talk about is like relocalizing the food system and like how do we kind of close the loops and think about things in this local and bioregional way. And then I remember going to one of the council meetings and the local city government or town government, and it was like something out of the 1800s. I mean, like everything is on paper, like the way that, the formalities were conducted and the voting and I was like, oh wait, like any romantic idea that like this is the way to operate was suddenly brought into question of like, well, actually we do need to upgrade our forms of local governance as well. And I think this is where, like you said, if someone figures out something great in one place and then we can just quickly export it to another place, then we can have still this kind of collective evolutionary intelligence while still provisioning resources and material goods and so forth, maybe in a more localized manner.
Yeah. I mean, there's an opportunity to reinvent democracy for the 21st century, I think. I know that sounds big, but I really think that that's where we are.
We kind of have to.
And I ran a Quadratic funding campaign in downtown Boulder, in the town that I live. In 2020, COVID was ravaging the world and downtown Boulder, and a lot of these businesses in downtown had seen their foot traffic drop by like 95%. And we did a Quadratic funding round with a comic book shop, a yoga studio, a chocolate shop, and a bookshop. I forget what exactly which businesses were in the round. And it turns out Quadratic funding works the same. The psychology of give $1 and the project gets $10 works exactly the same outside of crypto. And, we abstracted all the crypto stuff away. They were just using Stripe. But, that to me was an example of, we could really coordinate locally in order to make it happen. But also, to your point about the city government and how they operate, I was not able to get anyone in the city to talk to me. And I actually relied on local philanthropists to fund the round. And I think that there's, we'll have to build up more legitimacy and momentum to be able to go and draw funds from those type of environments. And I'm really excited about the upside for when we finally can. Hopefully that'll be a theme of Ethereum localism and cosmolocalism for the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, totally. Well, bringing it back to the book, I mean, we've kind of been talking about the old system and the new system. You gave a talk at Funding the Commons the other day, and you mentioned kind of the legacy state and the new state of capital allocation. And maybe bringing it back to the book, like how is that in your mind look from old to new?
Yeah. So you can get the book at allobook.gitcoin.co. I think that there'll be a link in the show notes that you can check out if you're listening. And the book's free. I'm not trying to make any money off of it. Although if you want to get a print edition, it's $20. And, we put a lot of work into the art of the book just to make it into a reading experience that feels like you're part of a movement and feels like you're part of a vibe.
And who did all these graphics?
Anya, she's a really amazing, talented designer. And the sort of like marching orders that I gave her was, I want to take this thing that's like very cold and academic and appears in these academic white papers, and I want to make it into a vibe. I want to show off how these digital networks resemble biological networks and how we're building this infinite garden of organisms that are interconnected and codepend on each other. And I want every mechanism to look like it's like the root system of a plant or of a mycelial network or something like that. And I want to make it very colorful and into a vibe that you'd be excited to wear to a party or like a rave.
Anya, you did a beautiful job.
Anya, you did a great job.
Yeah.
And the goal of the book is to make this an exciting design space to explore as opposed to like a cold academic design space. And that's what we've tried to do. And so making the content consumable has been a point of the book. You can get the book's free to download as a PDF, and then you can order one if you want to get the art for $20, and that's just cost for me. And then we also uploaded the book to a GPT that has read the book. So if you're not a big reader, you can explore the design space, which is a cool form factor for a book. And Sorry, you asked me a question and I just started shilling the book. What
Well,
was the
no, it's
question
great.
again?
I mean, you in your talk at Funding the Commons, you talk about legacy versus new.
Sure, yeah, that's what I was getting to. Okay, so basically the design space here is on-chain capital allocation. And that sounds like a mouthful, but capital allocation is just the act of spending money. If you bought a coffee this morning, you're allocating capital. And at scale, with lots of money, capital allocation becomes a full-time job for grant administrators and regional governments and VCs. And, it's a full-time job for people. And it's also existential for the people that depend on those decisions, whether or not their projects get funded, from local parks to roads and bridges to clean air, clean water. And then there's digital public goods like open source software. And I think that what's at stake here is, how are we going to fund what matters in the 21st century? And how are we going to build collective action in the 21st century? How are we going to solve coordination failures in the 21st century, all the way from the local coordination failures, things like how am I going to keep my park clean down the street from me, to how do I keep the roads safe and open, to the global ones like climate change and biodiversity. And the beautiful thing about Ethereum and the internet is that it's a global thing, and it's also a very local thing. So you can build systems that span both of those sizes and everywhere in between. And so basically, like high level, the sort of like hypothesis here is that legacy capital allocation, think like your city government, is not scalable and precise at allocating capital, and it's subject to gatekeeping. So you think about someone in a city government or an NGO that's trying to figure out how to fund what matters to their constituents, and they're basically, because they're the ones that are giving out money in their communities, they sort of become power brokers in these communities. And that's sort of like an inversion of, I think, like going there to help people is like gaining power over them. And I also think that you see these grant programs that develop all this bureaucracy and like 20-page grant applications and like multiple steps and blah blah blah, and like the bureaucracy sort of consumes the mission. And there's some of these NGOs that spend 40% of their budget on administrative overhead. And so I really think that there's an opportunity to redesign how we do capital allocation in the 21st century. On-chain capital allocation can leverage the properties of blockchains, global, transparent, immutable, and programmable ledgers. And so we can program our values into our money. We can build networks that are better at allocating capital. And so can we build more democratic systems of capital allocation, systems that leverage edge-based intelligence to see what everyday constituents in them want, not just like a power broker in an ivory tower. And that's the design space that I think is really, really cool. And I try to illustrate that in the book and get people excited about this movement of funding what matters on chain. If the internet changed how information flows in society, and that gave us social media and new forms of entertainment and media and politics, I think that blockchains are going to change how value flows in society. And that's going to change, yes, for-profit things like investments and how do we fund art, but also how do we fund what matters? How do we fund public goods? And that's the design space that I went into at the Funding the Commons talk and also in the book.
I love it. Yeah. Well, I have many great things to say about Gitcoin. I really am appreciating everything that this community has done. And you have this really cool way of talking about lofty future ideas, but then still executing a high performance organization that's very practical and in the weeds.
Protopia.
And doing stuff.
The key is Protopia. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to really acknowledge is, in our conversations and these interviews, one theme that's been coming up is we're talking to like Gmo from Sylvie or Owocki from Hypercerts, or this morning, David Dow and Sharfi from Gainforest, and people who have been relying on the grants programs and the community rounds to get their projects off the ground. And I've been pulling on this thread of like, what does venture capital inside of the nature space look like, in also what's its shadow side, because it creates all these incentives that can sometimes lead to a lot of challenges downstream. And it's not to be dogmatic against venture, but I think part of my conclusion is that like the early stage of projects, if we can just increase the runway a bit, where they don't have to sell out immediately to like super rapid growth venture capital incentives before they find product market fit and so forth, it just gives the entrepreneurs and the founders like a lot more sovereignty and leeway. And we're seeing more examples of projects that are able to do that because of the Gitcoin rounds. And so it's like this very tiny, practical, quotidian example within our nature space. But it's like, I think it points to that future where if we can allocate capital in more pluralistic ways and program our values into our money, like then we're going to see all of these positive outcomes as a consequence.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a real blessing to be here at DevCon. And a lot of times my first interaction with someone will be, I got $10,000 off Gitcoin and it got me through a hard time. And that feels cool to be doing that at scale. And, I think as the founder of Gitcoin, I'll get more credit and more blame than I deserve when Gitcoin either screws up or does well. And, I just want to take a moment to recognize all of the contributors, both, to the software and to the rounds and to the movement that we're a part of and stewarding and building and also a beneficiary of. And so Gitcoin's a movement, and I might be sort of the face of it because people understand founders and their narratives, but it's a movement of people who are working on this stuff. And what I'm going to keep trying to do is I have access to all the different parts of the movement because I founded Gitcoin, and I'm going to keep trying to democratize the knowledge and the access to those things and pay it forward to the next founder that comes along that wants to build a Protopia. And that's how we build a movement, is we amplify each other.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, when people ask me for the first time getting in the Web3 space, like, where's the signal from the noise and where do I go? And I'm skeptical of this. I'm always sending them to Gitcoin. And Sweet. I hope people check out the book. It's a great piece of work. And not your first book, third, fourth? How many of these have you done now?
I mean, who's counting at this point? I think we're at over half a dozen at this point.
Wow,
but,
cool.
I mean, I really like, I said, democratizing my knowledge, and I think we're over 6 books now. I've done 200 podcast episodes, and it's just like there's a lot of really smart people that have a lot to teach us, and so and yourself included. I think that you're like gaining a lot of knowledge and access and democratizing a lot of information through Ma Earth. So it's a pleasure to chat with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. And just go to allobook.gitcoin.co. There is a link in the show notes as it happens. For more on the book, check out the Green Pill podcast, Kevin's podcast, which we didn't shill too much, but a great repository of knowledge and conversations. And like you said, over 200 interviews.
Yeah, 200 interviews, yeah.
Yeah, but who's counting? For more great conversations from here at DevCon and for others in the Web3 space and much more, just go to maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.